Welcome back to Beyond the Crime, the podcast that takes you into the minds of criminals with your hosts, Dr. Lars Madsen, Shay Addison, and Dr. Rob Brockman.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to another Beyond the Crime podcast, the psychological analysis. And I'm here today with my co-host, Shay Addison. Welcome, Shay. And
thank you, Lars. Good to be back.
And we are welcoming back. This is our first time we've had a guest attend the podcast twice. It's the wonderful Nathan, Doctor from New Zealand. And welcome, Nathan. You were on our podcast last year when we were discussing lone actor violence, and at that stage, your upcoming book, Mass Casualty: The Rise of Lone Actor Violence, which of course has been published in the last few months. I have a copy with me right here. I'm holding it up. It's a very striking cover, Nathan. For the folks that are listening, it has a picture of a handgun and I guess that's a gas mask. Is that right? Something like
yes.
That. Welcome, Nathan. It's wonderful to have you back.
Thank you for having me back.
And it's been an exciting time. Tell us a little bit about, before we get into, I guess, today's podcast was partly inspired because of your recently published books, and we thought we could talk a little bit more about that and how you found that. But obviously, in the last few months, what do you know? You published this book, Nathan, and we have a couple of major cases of lone actor violence in both Australia and in the US. Now, of course, in Australia, both of them are sort of ongoing cases, I suppose. We've got the fellow down in Victoria, Dezi Freeman. Shay will give us a little bit of rundown on him in a minute. And then, of course, there was the killing of Charlie Kirk in the US by an individual who would fit the criteria of being a lone act of violence driven by ideology. So it seems very, prophetic, a serendipity, I guess. Is it a happy coincidence? Maybe not. But that your book is being published and these cases sort of come to the fore. And I suppose today is a very good time where we can sort of try to make sense of this stuff and see if we can apply schema therapy to it from what we know, and whether a schema therapy is a useful model for trying to make sense of how this phenomena actually occurs.
Yeah, I mean, it may be a little fortuitous, I guess, in some ways, but that's probably what led to me writing the book, was that, you know, when you start to connect the dots over the last decade or so, that there's just been this constant peppering of these cases which are not going anywhere. And unfortunately, they may actually be, I guess, increasing or evolving. And yeah, the cases that we've seen, the Charlie Kirk incident, which is terribly tragic, really highlights where this is progressing to. It makes me think I probably nearly need to do a rewrite of the book already, but we're certainly seeing some of this moving now maybe more towards no longer targeting masses of people, but narrowing in on someone that might represent a perceived face of that injustice or that cause or that organisation. So it's still targeted violence, and there's still very many similarities for the profiles of the perpetrator. It's just who they're targeting and how it's being expressed now.
Yeah, and this leads me to my question, like when we look at lone actor violence, and is that a more frequently occurring phenomena now or in the last 5 or 10 years than it was, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago at other times?
Oh, look, I think it is. Across Australia and New Zealand, there's been around 17 terrorist designated attacks since 2014. So that's a big increase in numbers compared to, say, the decade before. And then Europe and the UK has had very similar rates. I think there was one figure at one point talking about a 400% increase in lone actor terrorist attacks over the last 30 or so years. And then we look at the US and the just continuation, probably a couple of incidents a week where there's mass casualty attacks, particularly mass shootings over there. So it's either it has increased, and then arguably, is it now staying constant, or is it still continuing to increase I guess time will tell, and we can sort of debate that through.
Yeah, right. So what the statistics are showing us is if I'm hearing you right, is that in the last 5, 10, maybe 20 years, the rate of this phenomena is increasing, is different to how it was previously. So something feels like it's changed in terms of violence. I guess you were alluding to the fact that maybe, you know, people's motivations maybe have shifted or something like that. But I guess we're going to discuss why that might be in today's pod.
Yeah, and we probably see it probably bucks the trend in some ways compared to a lot of other types of serious offending. Certainly, you know, sexually violent offending and homicides, or even intimate partner homicides, which of course are tragic and receive a lot of attention. The data would show, though, that those statistics are on the decline. Mass casualty is arguably increasing, or certainly has increased over a decade.
Oh, that's fascinating. Of course, that's one of the statistics that isn't talked a lot about in the media, is the fact that violence across the board has actually been reducing over the last 20, 30 years. So we're a lot less sexually violent, we're a lot less physically violent, we're a lot less abusive, and even I think I saw a statistic, you know, harming animals those statistics have sort of plummeted in the last 2 or 3 decades, and that's well recognized across the board, isn't it?
Yeah,
and here we have this phenomena that seems to be bucking the trend. Interesting, fascinating.
Yeah, and I think as we talk today, you know, we do have to take a deep dive into what is going on at the psychosocial level across society for this to be happening.
Wow. Yes, I'm going to look forward to have this.
The role of the internet, I think, as well. You know, if you think about what's risen in the last couple of decades, it's everybody's access to the World Wide Web, isn't it? And everything that's involved in the depths of that.
Yeah, a factor that couldn't be excluded as a relevant variable to this phenomenon. But maybe, Shay, it would be good for us to start just discussing the outline of the Dezi Freeman case. So for the folks who are not familiar with this, who might be listening elsewhere in the world, Dezi Freeman is an individual who's gone on the run in Victoria, which is a state in the south of Australia, next to South Australia, actually. And he went on the run after he was confronted by police at his home, where he ended up shooting one of the police and killing. Was it one or two? It was two, was it? It was two policemen
police officers
when they attempted to engage him. And now he's been on the run. And as of this point, he remains on the run and his whereabouts is unknown. So, Shay, why don't you tell us a little bit about Dezi Freeman and this case?
Well, yeah, you've kind of introduced it there. I think it's probably, you know, one of the largest manhunts in police history, certainly in Victoria, understandably. So the case really, Dezi Freeman is a man who, in fact, changed his name from Philby Freeman, which, you know, free man, and declares himself a sovereign citizen, or identifies as a sovereign citizen. So in Australia, sovereign citizens sort of seem to pop their head up every now and then, and they're basically people that, you know, don't agree with being governed by the laws of the land. So they believe that their little patch, or wherever they are in Australia, is sovereign to them. So they don't subscribe to government control, basically. So anti-authoritarian, anti-government views. And this man had a long history of being, ensconced in that sort of worldview. He's married, he's got children, and a long history, from what the news sources have shown, of having lots and lots of conflict with local police and being very anti-police. I guess what happened was he lives in a rural community in Victoria, which is in the southern part of Eastern Australia, and that he had an outstanding warrant, and a group of police, I believe up to 8 or 10 police, like a large number of them, went to his residence, obviously knowing that he's anti-police, anti-authoritarian, and to serve an outstanding warrant on him. And the warrant, I believe, was for what is being reported as being for historical child sex offences. And unfortunately, the tragic outcome of that interaction was that 2 police officers were shot dead as they're trying to serve the warrant on him and arrest him and take him in for that. There's been a protracted sort of negotiation there, which has ended in the very tragic, fatal shooting of 2 police officers with a homemade gun. And then he has fled the scene, and he's not. They haven't found him, and the manhunt in Victoria goes on with all of the possible resources available to the government, and they're yet to find him. So I don't know, Nathan. How would you categorize that in terms of he's definitely a lone actor, I guess, but it's not. Does that fit the mass casualty kind of vibe? Or, I mean, it's more than one death, I suppose, but how would you see that?
Yeah, the interesting aspect probably for, a mass casualty is we often think about someone going out and seeking out people to kill. What this has probably got parallels to is the Willambilla Queensland case where Nathaniel Gareth and Stacey Train killed, I think it was 2 police officers, and a couple others were injured, and also a neighbour was killed as well, I think, from memory, where, again, police were going there to visit the residence. I'm not sure whether they were executing a warrant or just trying to track down. I think it was
the missing persons complaint or something.
One of the trains, one of the males, I don't know if it was Nathaniel or Gareth, but they were then attacked upon arriving on the scene. And when we think about it in terms of the lone actor space, the parallels as well are also that there's often a similar sort of underlying belief system that may be driving the ideologies or the way that they're viewing the world and viewing perceived threats. There might be the grievances that they've developed that are pushing them towards violence. So there's a lot there that makes it very similar, even though he hasn't gone out and sought out a group to target. But there's sort of a similar underlying belief system and maybe ideological system that could be relevant to the matter.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it's, the key difference, I guess, being that he's not planned to think, right, well, I'm going to go out and target these people. But when they have come into his space, is definitely that's been the end result. And he's left, as everyone does these days, a bit of a digital footprint, I guess. And what's reported in the press was that he had made posts on, I believe it was an Instagram account, of saying that I think one of the things he wrote was the only good cop is a dead cop. And he talked about his grievances about how the Australia state had the police were akin to the Gestapo. So he's making all of these very, quite bold statements about believing that the police don't have the authority to do the things they are. They're corrupt, and they deliberately target people in general, but specifically him. And a lot of his conflict or interactions with the police came around fairly benign things like traffic incidents, being pulled over for speeding, using a mobile phone while he's in the car. It hasn't been for major things like, I don't know, like major criminal incidences.
Yeah, it's in some ways, I think it's good to go back and look at, we can focus on the ideology, and there's lots of nuances to the sovereign citizen movement along with many other different ideologies. But I always go back to, what's kind of the foundation or the basis of it for these folks. And really, Karl Wernick back in the 1800s, a psychiatrist, coined the term overvalued ideas, and Tahir Rahman, a psychiatrist over in the States, has revisited that and reworked that and now terms it as extremely overvalued beliefs. And often it's the building rock for a lot of the psychological foundation for these fellows, where it's a series of overvalued or extremely overvalued beliefs that they place great weight on. They look for anything that aligns with those beliefs, and then they filter out anything that contradicts that, and they become more dogged and rigid and committed to that. And we see that cognitive inflexibility around that, the idea of sort of you're with us or against us, good or bad, very black and white type of thinking. And then as time goes on, that then becomes fused with their identity. This is who I am. This is what I stand for. And they become prepared to defend that. And that can, we can add other personal factors to that can, fuel that and accelerate that. And it seems certainly across a lot of the lone actor space and potentially in this situation, it's a similar sort of function that's led to this fellow being in the position that he's in.
Nathan, I was wondering whether you could just, for the benefit of some listeners, explain what an overvalued idea is as opposed to a belief or some idea that you hold strongly. What's the red line for overvalued belief or idea?
Well, really, it's probably the inflexibility around it. It's when we lose our objectivity, when we lose the ability to see something from alternative perspectives, and we become very rigid and stuck around that. So, some of us have very overvalued beliefs about our ideas. It might be around our sports teams or those sorts of things, or various sort of aspects.
I can certainly relate to that.
Yeah. And the problem is that it's when we have a lack of flexibility around that. And, Tahir Rahman in his work would say, extreme overvalued beliefs, when it gets dialed up to the point that it is extreme and quite intense, can lead to things like eating disorders, for instance, or body dysmorphia. It can even be associated with, gender dysphoria and things like that, where the person enters into, an initial belief or initial set of ideas about things, and they reinforce it over time. And so if we think about it in terms of, anorexia, for instance, under that scenario, they may initially begin with doubts about their body image, maybe some distortions about how they look and what is healthy. And then as it gets reinforced over time, that might be through maybe validation. Someone compliments them with how they're looking. It might be through social media, all the images that are popularized. And they then might start restricting their diet. So that change, the behavior then changes in association with the thoughts. And eventually they then become more committed. It becomes more reinforced. And they get to the point where it becomes sort of integrated into who they are. So it's really that process, I guess, a little bit like the scenario of radicalization in some ways. We're talking about where someone starts and where someone ends up and how that process takes place for the person.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Because it's also, I guess, within psychology and psychiatric terms, we have like someone can have a delusion, which is an irrational idea, right? That is not connected to reality. But overvalued ideas kind of skates up close to that, but doesn't quite cross over. So it's like a belief or an idea that exists in but is irrational and extreme, but not quite unconnected to reality. Yeah.
Yeah, so you've got that spot on. I probably should have pointed that out. So, extremely overvalued beliefs are beliefs that are not unique to the individual. So with a delusion, it's unique to the individual often. They are the second coming of Christ. It's not something that's shared by others, but extremely overvalued beliefs are something that are shared by other people, even if it's a very small minority of people, but it's not something that's unique to the individual. So others will hold that belief, even though it might be a low number of people, but others will have that.
Does that kind of fit with, do you think, where the sense of identity comes from? It fuses with their identity because they're not just on their own. You can find a tribe of people that reinforce that. So even the name sovereign citizen, it kind of also has what sort of popped into my head just before was also football hooliganism, like in the UK, because that's violence as well there, it's not just an identity, but it is, they're definitely an identity and a willingness to defend your tribe, so to speak, but with violence.
Yeah. And I think it's important to point out that, there's so many groups that are popping up these days in whether it's sovereign citizens, incels, sort of extreme climate change activists. And look, those in and of themselves, they're not problematic, but it's when it gets to the point where it is extreme, where it is overvalued, and where you're willing to put yourself or others in a position of harm to defend that. So it's fine to hold these beliefs, but it's when it progresses towards violence as a means to defend that cause or progress that cause. That's what we would say is violent extremism.
Where it feels like violence is necessary or a reasonable solution to it. I'm just kind of reflecting as you described it. I know that we talked about Dezi Freeman. We mentioned Charlie Kirk at the top of the pod today. Sort of what we know about the alleged killer of Charlie Kirk, it kind of fits very much with what we're sort of talking about here. So this fellow is called Tyler Robertson. He's a 22-year-old electrical apprenticeship student, and he targeted Charlie Kirk apparently for his conservative views because he perceived them as being hateful. And he planned the attack, and the media sort of notes that he is to have left the notes sort of saying that he had the opportunity to take Charlie Kirk out and that he was going to do that. He's texted his roommate saying he's had enough of his hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated with. And he's been identified as having been influenced by left-leaning ideology over the last period of time. So he had bullet casings which were engraved with phrases such as "Hey fascist, catch this." And, so he certainly seems like, so he comes from a background, as far as I understand it, like quite a conservative family, Mormon background. And something happened along the way where it sort of shifted him to become, this extremist, where violence was a solution and a reasonable response to a perceived threat.
Yeah, I think you've summed that up very well. And again, the value that he's placed on those belief systems, you'd have to question, whether that became linked to his identity and his ability to, whether he saw himself as sort of a warrior for a cause. Time will tell around that. And then you also think about the personal or psychological vulnerabilities for an individual. What is it exactly that's going on for them that has been shaping their lives that has made them susceptible to being consumed by these belief systems and then integrating it into their identity? And I think that's an important question. And there's no doubt that you can immerse yourself in an online space, as we've seen, that echo chamber effect where you're bathed in essentially just a flooding of extreme content. So that is certainly an aspect. But I also come back to the individual and think that people don't necessarily just fall into that space where the internet takes hold of them. There's got to be some pre-existing vulnerabilities there to do that and shape that.
What I find fascinating, like with this fellow, and I mean, I don't know anything about his history, but from what I can read about Tyler Robinson, is that he doesn't have any violent criminal history or issues with violence in the past, which, of course, when you're a forensic psychologist and you're doing a risk assessment on violence and you're trying to make sense of why someone would do what they do, very rarely do you see someone doing extreme violence, although it does happen, but very rarely do you see someone doing extreme violence and deliberately choosing that where they don't have some history of some red flags or clues in their past where violence was an option, violence was used, violence was okay. And suddenly you see individuals like this guy who seems to be a young, fit, healthy individual, good-looking guy, choosing extreme violence in a situation like this. And you're thinking, how does that happen? Like what, I guess this is what we're getting at. Like how does he get affected and in this way where this is the decision-making that a completely reasonable, non-psychotic individual engages in?
When you look at his the text messaging that they've published between him and what they say is his roommate/partner, it looks as though he's quite in the initial aftermath of actually having successfully killed Charlie Kirk. It looks like he was definitely planning on trying to get away and conceal what he'd done. So it wasn't, for me, you look at it, it wasn't, perhaps about a big public status event, because I think one of the texts he sent was saying, well, I'd hope to take this to my grave. So that sort of belies an intention that was just, he felt, that taking out Charlie Kirk, that was vindication for whatever he was trying to achieve.
So I guess that would say that his motivation wasn't notoriety, perhaps. Like he wasn't doing it to say, look at me, look what I've achieved. It was driven perhaps purely by other kinds of motives, maybe ideological motives to take out the enemy or people that are considered a threat to
And
ideology.
The bizarre thing that he seemed to be focused on afterwards, which, given the gravity of what he'd just done, was that he was worried about returning his grandfather's rifle.
Wow.
That his dad would be upset that his granddad's rifle, which was a gift to him, would be in the possession of the police, or he wouldn't get it back, which I think that is some pretty interesting anxiety to have post just assassinating and murdering somebody.
Yeah. And it says something perhaps about how particular kinds of ideologies or beliefs can completely sort of dehumanize the other as being not worthy or valued of any kind of compassion, concern, or empathy.
Well, it's just like an everyday kind of thing to be concerned about, like a bit of housekeeping or something, which seems at odds with the act that he's just engaged in. I don't know, Nathan, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think you've touched on quite a few of them, but I would say that as a sort of population, and we've seen the young fellow Thomas Crooks, I think it was, if I got the name accurate, who shot Trump, very similar profile. And there seems to be somewhat of there's a lack of resilience, a general disconnect and disconnection, and also probably a demoralization that's happening with some of these younger folks that we're seeing, combined with being immersed often in violent content online, identifying with violence, quite extreme views and beliefs, and that then culminating together to lead people to feel as though, hostility is sort of a starting point. Hostility towards those that are different is an acceptable and appropriate way to deal with your problems. And then some will go even further to condone violence or try and promote violence. And then we see those that are willing to actually take it into their hands and act on that. I think there's a lot going on at the societal level, and the internet certainly plays a role in that. But yeah, it's the lack of sort of resilience in some ways I probably boil it down to, and the inability to respond to challenges, setbacks, to tolerate differences in opinion and opposing speech, and to become sort of morally outraged.
Yeah. I'd be interested, say more about what lack of resilience, like with these fellows, how would we define that? Like you're saying, an inability to tolerate other people's having a different view or disagreement or debate.
In the book, it was interesting. I stumbled across the research on self-esteem, and
in the book, Mass Casualty by Dr. Nathan Brooks, perhaps?
Yes. I mean, for me growing up, you heard all about self-esteem, and self-esteem is the answer to everything. If life's going bad, you have low self-esteem. You need to believe in yourself more and have a better self-esteem. But the self-esteem movement, really kind of populated through the 1990s and even probably in the early 2000s, and it was kind of viewed as the answer to everything. But it then became distorted in some aspects, where it was about we need to wrap everyone in cotton wool. Everyone gets a trophy. Everyone gets a certificate. Yeah. And we don't want to stress people. They stopped using things like red pens to mark people's assignments, and everyone got praised. And we became very concerned with how we give feedback, with making sure that we don't upset people. And from there, I think that can really grow, where we try to protect people, but actually we need a level of stress and discomfort in our lives to be able to face the hardships and challenges that arise as we progress into adults. And I think there's been a lot around where we just don't want people to experience difficulties, or alternatively, as a society and even at a parental level, we're not teaching the learnings around how do you deal with discomfort, how do you move through stress, because you have to be able to accept that it's not someone else's fault. It's not about blame. We need to take ownership. We need to have accountability, that kind of classic locus of control type of scenario where we bring it back to us rather than attribute it to other people. So there's a lot there, I think, where how we've taught and shaped and built resilience in children over the years hasn't been that great, and we need to get back to some of the basics, which is about helping people to have a level of autonomy and independence and realize that they are responsible for their own actions and choices.
And that they probably are
Yeah.
more resilient than they actually give them credit for. Because I'm thinking, remember the thing about trigger warnings, right? Like there was this thing, I don't know whether it still goes on. I'm sure it probably does, but there was the issue around, well, there's a trigger warning for this and that and this and that, to presumably alert people that something might upset them if they continue to watch or listen to whatever it is that they're watching or listening to, so that they can prepare themselves to either remove themselves or deal with it in some kind of way. And as far as my reading of the research, when they kind of evaluated the value of that, the trigger warnings do exactly the opposite of what it's trying to do, which is to help people, I guess, try to be more resilient, maybe not, but it makes people more anxious, experience more negative feelings. And there's also this thing at universities about microaggressions, where I think I don't know whether this was a big thing in the Australian universities, certainly not in the UK universities, at least when I went there. But but in American universities, it certainly seemed like there was a lot of emphasis and anxiety and concern around the concept of a microaggression and trying to, remove those kinds of things. Microaggressions are, as far as I can make sense of it, it's things that people might not intentionally mean to be aggressive, but is aggressive because at some level this disturbs the person receiving this microaggressions perception of themselves or experience of themselves or something like that. So we've seen this play out, haven't we? In the last 10 years or so.
I also came across a conference that I was looking at, potentially attending, and I was looking at the curriculum for it over the days, and it was, had the timings and the schedules and everything, and in part of it had audience wellness check-in. And I'd never seen that on a conference thing in 30 years ever. And I was fascinated. And because for me, my initial reaction was, it's a professional conference of people who are professionals in that area, in a forensic, violence kind of, conference. So that I guess I would assume that if you're attending that and you're working in that space, that I just thought that was a new thing to me. And it's kind of similar to the trigger warnings. It's similar to okay, we're having an audience wellness check-in, but the audience are professionals working in that field.
You almost expect that they would be responsible for their own resiliency.
Yes.
For being able to tolerate this stuff, right?
I would think that if we're requiring that, then, and that was a genuine, I don't know, mental health type of mini intervention that you would, question the resiliency of people choosing to work in that space if that's a necessary requirement. But I think it's just it's a reflection of some of this stuff that you've mentioned. And I had never witnessed that before. Maybe I just missed it. I don't know.
You're old and grizzled, Shay.
Yeah, maybe I'm just old and grizzled. But I think but it also sort of prompts the concept of maybe that having a problem with it is normal rather than being okay with it. It kind of creates that. Yeah, it sort of prompts the idea. But maybe check in with yourself. Are you having problems rather than not? So it kind of reflects, I guess, Nathan, about what you're saying about the sort of the resilience, and Lars with the trigger warnings, rather than kind of focusing on, you got to be responsible for your own stuff, and you have to be able to tolerate and manage content that might be somewhat distressing. And in our field, it often is. But that's just, but that's being resilient to that is an important part of your own individual responsibility.
What's fascinating about what you're saying, Nathan, though, is you're saying that what seems like a good idea, which is being nice to everybody and giving everyone trophies. I don't know whether, this is exactly the thing, but in a sense, it seems like a nice idea. It seems like a nice idea to be able to ensure that people don't experience bad feelings or feel left out or feel hurt feelings. Actually, what it does, potentially, I guess this is the hypothesis, that it actually doesn't allow people to develop resiliency when they confront the reality of life. And the reality of life, I guess, is that you're going to bump into people who are going to be disagreeable, who are going to have different opinions, who are going to look and say and do things differently in the way that you would want them to. And because maybe we have had a culture, we've had people being exposed to this idea that that's unbearable, or you can't tolerate that, or it's extreme in some way, that feels overwhelming. And then the response is to perhaps go to an extreme response as a way of resolving that and dealing with it, which, in some cases may mean violence.
Yeah, and then you've got that pattern there, and then you're spending hours online where you are constantly seeing and having that put back in your face, where you're seeing different views and things that outrage you, and you can't escape it, and then there's others that are aligning with you and fueling your position and making you feel more morally outraged, then that becomes a really difficult dilemma for the person to sit with, because they have their in-group that essentially are reinforcing their position, but then they are seeing a world where the polar opposite is happening, and the ability to sit with those emotions becomes very, very challenging. And that's where we see demoralization set in, ultimately, where the person, perceives a sort of existential crisis and feels helpless to do anything about it. And people then can resort to hostility or violence when that becomes just simply too much for them to cope with and handle. The other thing I kind of want to throw out to both of you in writing the book, and we've touched on this, Lars, is the hero's journeys. We've got this dysfunctional way that people are sort of coping with problems, and they've lost their autonomy and independence, and there's not a lot of resilience that's being cultivated in younger folks. But at the same time, we are very much, as humans, hardwired to try and make sense and meaning of situations. And we will do that one way or another, whether it's healthy or whether it's maladaptive and dysfunctional. And so I think if we come back to that, for mass casualty attacks, a lot of these folks think they're on a quest or a mission, or they're a warrior for the cause. So they are pursuing some sort of journey, some sort of call to adventure. And they are trying to be, ultimately, whether it's their own, whether it's a hero or whatever it might be, but they are trying to make meaning and sense of this situation that they find themselves in. And when we think about what that might mean then from getting in early, at an early prevention level, imagine if we were able to get into schools and teach the hero's journey, help people realize that actually challenges, setbacks, maybe even adversity, they're normal, and they shape you for the better. If you have the guidance and support around you, they can actually be the catalyst for becoming stronger and more capable. But without that understanding, without that framework, without educating our younger people, they can actually be the factors that derail us and send us on these pathways towards violence. So I think there's a huge need to, how do we foster psychological resilience? And for me, the antidote to psychological resilience is giving people the psychological skills to work through their challenges and adversities and realize that they can be their own hero, that they can rise from these setbacks the setbacks can come to define who they are in a really positive way, rather than in a negative and dysfunctional way.
I agree, Nathan. A question for you, right? So what we're talking about, this honing in on this concept of, perhaps younger people being less resilient than their older, more grizzled folk, is that's across the board in terms of society. But correct me if I'm wrong, the mass casualty and the lone act of violence is a very gendered crime, almost exclusively male.
Yes, mostly males.
So the manifestation of some of those problems is very gendered. It just kind of goes one way, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, men tend to often externalize, don't they, when they've got emotional problems, and women will often internalize that. And we know that, males blacked out in one way or another. They might internalize it to start with, and then it'll hit a threshold where they're unable to cope, and then it will be expressed. But men are more likely to kill themselves. I think it's, at least roughly 80% of the suicides, if I've got that right, are by males. But, roughly 80 to 90% of the violent crimes are also by males. So we see that there's a lot of work there to do for men. But I would go back to, are our men becoming lost these days? What is masculinity for men? We need to make sure that we're not saying, much to some people's views, that, masculinity is healthy, but we need to find a way to make it healthy though and be expressed healthy. Otherwise it can become, problematic. But, we need to think about men, who they are, what they stand for, and men particularly are drawn towards, direction and goals, and masculinity comes about from accomplishment in many ways for a lot of men.
When you think about the lone act of violence or the mass casualties, can you think of any examples where there were females who were the perpetrators?
Oh, look, there has been a couple. We've seen some transgender cases as well. I think for memory, they are often males that are now identifying as females. In Australia, we had Mamina Shoma, who was a Bangladeshi national that came over and carried out a targeted attack in, I think it was 2018, and stabbed her homestay host, first female incarcerated in Australia for terrorism offences. But it is rare. It is largely, as we said, very much predominantly males.
Okay.
So if we were to kind of sort of break down, like, why the change? What are the factors that you think, Nathan, has led to the shift in and the rise in lone actor violence in the last 10, 15 years?
Well, as we've touched on, I think there's the change in probably children and how resilience and hardiness occurs, and some of that's been at the...
We're saying that the lack of resilience means that being exposed to particular kinds of ideas or values or that don't mirror or they agree with becomes unbearable, becomes intolerable.
Yeah, so that's part of it. Then we couple that with the rise of the internet and this world of all sorts of media that is just, a click away, and it is very powerful, and it can be very addictive, and the sort of dopamine cycles and reinforcements that can come from that, and you can be exposed to all sorts of things that you never would have been exposed to a decade ago. So I think the immersion in extreme content and violent content as well. Along with that, I think there's a breakdown in our face-to-face interactions as well. As a society, we've moved more online rather than having social connections. So that plays a role. Even things like single-parent households, the breakdown of sort of family structures and extended members being involved in children's lives as well. So childhood can be quite a lonely and isolated place now, with a lack of positive influences. And then, adding to that, look, trauma is always a factor that sits there, I think, for any type of offending. So that can be a factor in the background, those adverse childhood experiences. Then we have the fact that there's just so many mass casualty attacks occurring now, where we can get a copycat effect going on and a contagion effect. So we know in the suicide literature that when we have periods where there's suicides, that other suicides can be triggered. There's a contagion aspect to that. I think there's a contagion aspect to some of these attacks now. We see that it's a way to express our life's problems, and it brings notoriety and it brings significance and it becomes normalized. And then the copycat effect as well, which is largely a product of sort of the online space.
I just want to double click on a couple of those points. One of the things I think with the internet that is I think really relevant to the development of particular kinds of ideas, overvalued ideas and ideologies becoming more extreme, is the fact that you kind of very quickly can kind of get funneled down into a particular ideology. Like, so if you're conservative or you're left wing or whatever you might be sort of interested in on the internet, or you start looking at, the algorithm kind of picks this up, it seems, and then pushes more of that stuff your way. So people very quickly, I think, can get down a rabbit hole where all they're being exposed to are these ideas in various forms of extremeness, I guess, right? And And what also can happen, right, I guess, with the internet is that you can then actively block other kinds of points of view, alternative points of view. Because you think back in the day when, we didn't have the internet as accessible as it was today. And there was, people, would watch television at night, and you'd sit down and if you're in Australia, you'd maybe watch the regular news, and then you'd watch the ABC news, and then there'd be 7:30 report, and you would get exposed to like like we'd all be exposed to the same kind of media, and might disagree or agree on it. But now you don't have to be. You can create it your life. So you're only exposed to the stuff that you agree with and feel passionately about. And that has got to make people more extreme, I think.
Yeah. And we know that what makes algorithms work and more views and more likes is the controversial content, and that we've lost the middle ground now online. It's the loudest, most extreme stuff that garners the most traction. And then if you've got a young person viewing that at a key developmental psychological point in their lives, and they don't have a strong sense of self, a strong sense of who they are, and they don't have other things in their lives, sport, friendships, hobbies, activities that are taking them away from that and giving them different perspectives, the compounding effect of that then can be quite enormous.
The other thing that I reflect upon is it's the copycat effect and the contagion effect that you mentioned, because in the work that I've done with clients who've been referred for these kinds of issues, they're on the pathway to these lone act of violent episodes. I've had a number of clients who've been referred by the police because they've managed to pick them up before anything has actually happened, and they've become quite radicalized. And what's interesting about these cases that I found was a bit of a thread between them. There's a couple of things. One is that they felt extremely excluded and isolated in their communities, right? So they felt rejected, excluded, and isolated, and they sought that sense of connection through communities online. And incidentally, they managed to end up in extreme sort of chat groups, that incel type of chat groups. So that was one thread that linked them, and the other thread was their accessing of those kind of chat rooms with those kinds of individuals also exposed them to individuals that they started to admire, who had gone and shot up schools in America and other kinds of places, and in a sense, in these groups, they idealized, idolatized, is that what we're called? Is that a word? I don't know. But they really revered these individuals. And they would then start to think, oh, this is something that I can do. This would be great. This would give me status. This would give me amongst everyone. So in a sense, you could almost see this trajectory unfolding in real time for this individual. Isolated, lonely, disconnected, finds a group of individuals, becomes more radicalized over time because he feels that he's connected with folks, and then starts to be exposed to these extreme solutions to things and thinking, well, I could do something similar. This is reasonable. I would be validated and revered by people that I respect and like and hold, whose opinion I value.
So what, Lars, I put it to you, what happens with these young men, by and large, in terms of psychology when we're treating people with these problems? Key mediating factors to having these thoughts and desires and maybe being isolated but wanting to be, part of something, a key mediating factor to not acting on violence, is empathy, is the capacity to sort of understand, wow, that's another human being. And the idea that you might formulate a plan to actually murder someone or remove someone, oftentimes, a lot of people, having thoughts of violence or violent ideation is not such an uncommon thing in human beings. But the mediating factors for acting on it, just seem to be, where are they? What happens to them?
Well, I think that
because they're not all psychopathic, right? These guys that do this are not people who have technically what we might think of as people who are devoid of that sort of stuff, people who have personality structures where we're like, okay, well, that's just a part of how their personality is put together. That makes sense. It's just that's how they act across their life. This is a very narrow sort of wedge of behavior, but clearly factors like empathy and capacity for that to are removed in these instances.
Well, I think that I agree. I think the clients that I've seen in this space are not psychopaths, so they do have the capacity for empathy, and they crave human connection a lot of the time. But I think that what happens for them when they become radicalized in these spaces is that they start to view the other in a dehumanized way. Right? They start to and that's where I think empathy just gets turned off. Like they have empathy for their friends, for their cohort, people in the struggle, in the cause, but for other people outside of that, they don't. And why do they not? Because they're the enemy, or they have done this to me, or they oppress me, or
it's like a black and white type of thinking, like an us and them type of thinking, and them. They don't deserve empathy. That's more than just a lack
crusade. Like Nathan said, the hero's journey. This is a crusade for good. My definition.
Yeah. So it's like an extreme justification for, perpetrating what might even be like the ultimate harm to somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, Nathan. What do you think about that? In terms of understanding what those mediating factors to violence just are not in the picture there.
No. I mean, you're spot on, both of you, and it really is. We've talked about many of the factors that are similar to some forms of violence, but it's not necessarily our psychopathic folks. There might be some personality vulnerabilities. Some of them might be a little bit more narcissistic, leaning, entitled, self-absorbed. And struggle with empathy, but yeah, they are going down a sort of pathway where they're slowly becoming more narrow and tunnel visioned in how they see the world and others, and it is an us versus them, a black and white sort of thinking, in group, out group, and yeah, you do get that dehumanizing aspect that emerges where. It's okay to treat them differently because they are the enemy.
Yeah. Okay. That's fascinating.
We are coming to the end of our pod, and I think it would be maybe a good time to talk a little bit about your book, Nathan, Mass Casualty, The Rise of Lone Actors. I saw the other day a post that it was, what was it? It was selling more than, what was that famous author? I want to say...
Addison, I can't remember. It was one of them.
Addison, well, he's a...
John Fisherman might have been.
I certainly recognise his name. So it's going well. Tell us a little bit about the book, what inspired you, what you hope to do, what the reader will gain from reading your book, Mass Casualty, The Rise of Lone Actor Violence.
Well, look, it's not an academic book, so it's written for the everyday reader, and it's really about trying to shed a light on this issue. A lot of what we've talked about today, the rise in mass casualty violence, particularly by lone individuals that are self-initiating. They're not acting at the direction of others. They're self-initiating on their own accord to carry out these targeted acts. And the book really is in two parts. It looks at the pathway to violence. How do these people move towards violence? What motivates them? What factors contribute to that? What's there in their life that may make them vulnerable? The role of these beliefs and ideologies. And then the second part of the book is about searching for answers. What can we do about this phenomena? How are we going to think our way out of it? Because we've found ourselves in this position as a society, and it's happened for a reason. And there's a lot that we can do, whether it's from government agencies all the way to the individual practitioner or even family members that can try and shape the way that information is received, that decisions are made, and that we try and get in early and make the change with our young people before it gets to them. Being folks that are in their adulthood, I guess a similar scenario to the Dezi Freeman situation where, that it becomes sort of quite ingrained by that point. So if we get in early, it's much easier to intervene and change rather than when someone's at a latter stage of their life.
What does getting in early look like for someone?
Well, as we touched on before, I'd love to see something like the hero's journey as part of the school curriculum, where we're teaching people, we teach people to swim because it is a life skill, and we should be teaching people how to have the psychological skills to resolve problems and challenges in their lives. I think they are equally just as vital, because people are going to solve problems one way or the other. We can give them the skills to do that, or they will find ways to do that themselves, which is a flip of the coin which way that will go. And as we're seeing with some of these cases of violence, people are choosing very maladaptive ways to solve issues in their lives. So we've got to give them the skill set to be able to do that.
I love that, the hero's journey. And for the folks who might not be quite up to what the hero's journey is actually what is it? It's a narrative archetype that was developed by or identified by Joseph Campbell, who wrote the Hero with 1,000 Faces. And just to sum it up, the hero's journey serves as a metaphor for individual development, where adversity and self-discovery lead to change and renewal. And I think research suggests that if you're able to frame your life through this lens, it actually enhances personal meaning, resiliency, and purpose, particularly in contexts such as grief or existential challenges. So it's a storytelling sort of framework, I guess, but it's a way of making sense of experiences.
Yeah, and it normalizes adversity. So
it specifically identifies adversity as being necessary for personal change,
for growth.
Yeah.
And
of course, we have a training program also called the Hero's Journey on Schema Therapy, which is a cracking watch, I might say. I love it, because I think that's a wonderful metaphor to also incorporate as a way of addressing this phenomenon.
What have you got coming up, Nathan? Do you have any, workshops, lectures, more books up your sleeve that people can look out for?
So we've got an events, a forensic training business now, Groundproof Forensic Institute, which is, you can also find them at groundproofforensics.com, and that will have events in the forensic space for our forensic practitioners that are interested in training opportunities.
So how does that?
Great.
So this will be lectures or webinars, and people sign up and they go to it live?
Yes, webinars and we'll have in-person events. We've obviously had a couple of stalking events this year, hoping to roll out some of the violent extremism space in-person events, and then we'll have monthly webinars that people can join up to attend.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Nathan, for coming on the pod today. It's been, I think this is such a poignant topic right now in the world, isn't it? I think, there's something going on in the world, and this phenomena of lone act of violence just seems to sort of be popping up everywhere. It seems to be relevant. It seems to be in the media. So I think this has been a really fascinating conversation, and really excellent to have you on board for the second time. So thank you very much, Nathan, for coming on and giving us your wisdom on this topic.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you, Shay.
You're welcome.
All right.
Good to see you as always.
We'll finish there. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you're interested in learning more about schema therapy, join us in a hero's journey, the schema therapy sessions at schematherapytrainingonline.com.